Good morning, friends. Let me begin by thanking Chinmay Mission and specifically Swami Mitrananji for giving me this opportunity to come and speak to all of you. And of course, to all of you for making time to come here to Mahabalipuram to hear two economists drone on a Monday morning. The topic of the day is about Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. As Anand just told you, the basic thesis is about interconnectedness. And since we are economists, specifically about economic interconnectedness, but taking in a very more wider socioeconomic or even environmental perspective of interconnectedness. And in some ways, this is a very good place to start because you have to remember that interconnectedness is not, and globalization are not something that happened today. This has been going on for thousands of years, and Mahabalipuram actually has been at the center of this for a very long time. In fact, Mahabalipuram was historically one of India's largest ports. And under the period of the Pallava Empire, which ruled over this part of the country during the 7th, 8th, and 9th centuries, so for about a 200-year period, and built all the lovely temples which are in the vicinity. This was a thriving port with connections on one side with the Roman Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire, the Arabs, the Persians, but even more strongly with Southeast Asia. So I'm going to tell you a story about how these interconnections work, because this is not just a one-way interconnection outward, but also backward. That's how interconnection works. It's about exchange. So I'm going to tell you the story about one of the most important kings of this Pallava Empire, who had a very important role also, incidentally, of building some of the buildings you will see here. So let's go back to the beginning of the 8th century. What happened in the early 8th century is that the Pallava emperor of that time was killed in battle, and he died without an heir. So there was panic, because now there was no heir. There was real danger that the whole empire would spiral into chaos, that surrounding empires, particularly the Chalukyas, would come here and take it over. So there was absolute panic in the Pallava Empire. So a grand council of all the chieftains, intellectuals, priests, and ministers, etc., was held in Kanchipuram, which is not far from here as well. It was their capital, in which they debated what should be now done. When somebody remembered that about 100 years earlier, the younger brother of the then Pallava king, called Bhimavarma, had gone off and sailed off eastwards to Southeast Asia and had married a local princess. And that many generations later, his descendants were still living in Southeast Asia. We don't know exactly where. It was either Cambodia or southern Vietnam, the Champa, or it could even be northern Malaysia. We're not quite sure exactly where. But let's say most likely Cambodia. And so somebody suggested that why don't we go to Cambodia and get this prince, one of the descendants back, after all they are also Pallavas, to come back and rule over the Pallava Empire. Let's see if any descendant can come. So a delegation was sent from Kanchipuram, and they came here to Mahabalipuram. And from here, they sailed out to the east. And then they reached the court of this descendant of Bhimavarman. And they asked him, they explained the situation and said, do you have a son? Can you contribute one of your sons to this cause and to go back to India and rule over the empire of your ancestors? So he said, I think his name was Hiranyavarman. So he said, yes, I have 4 sons. So why don't you ask them? So there were 4 sons, and the delegation then called each one of them and asked them if they would go back to India to rule. So one by one they came. The first one was called, and he refused. basically, I don't know, we don't know exactly what he said, but presumably he was likeliest one to become the next king, so he didn't want to go off somewhere else far away. The next one was asked, he also refused. The third one was asked, he also refused. Finally, a young boy of 11 was called in, and he was asked if he was willing to go back to India and be crowned as the king of the Pallava Empire. So this 11-year-old agreed. So he was brought back here, and he was crowned to become Nandi Varman II. And Nandi Varman II would go on to become one of the greatest kings of southern India. He would defeat all the enemy kingdoms like the Chalukyas, etc., would re-establish the strength and vigor of the Pallavas. And of course, he would build a great temple in Kanchi where he would carve out this story that I just narrated to you. And underneath the carving of this story, he would also carve out the story in text as well. That's why we know this story. But when you look at the images of those carvings where he narrates the story, one of the things that strike you is that the faces in those carvings are not the faces of people from this part of India. They are clearly Southeast Asians. They look like Cambodians. Even the style in which the carving is done is very similar to the ones you will see in Angkor. Why I'm telling you this story is that so that you remember that the world has been a very interconnected place for a very, very long time. And it is incumbent on each generation to be able to renew these contacts. These contacts have enriched us, not just culturally and economically, but also allowed us to appreciate the interconnectedness of the planet on which we live and the fragility of it as well. Now, coming to the present time. Obviously, a platform like G20 is about managing the global commons. After all, we can all go and manage our own economies. Why do you need a platform like G20? We need a platform like G20 because there are a large number of interconnected things which cannot be taken care of by any individual country, but we must do this as humanity as a whole. Now, there's obviously climate change and environmental management, but also global supply chains, managing of global health, and anybody who's been recently through the COVID experience will know exactly what I mean, and so on and so forth. And in this context, the concept of Vasudhaiva becomes very important, because many of these global commons, unfortunately, can also be weaponized very easily. So, of course, the most obvious things that we now talk about is, say, for example, the weaponization of payment systems, of sanctions. Now, for whatever it's worth, whether you agree or disagree about certain countries being in conflict with other countries and so on, certain global commons being weaponized through sanctions, maybe you can use it once, maybe you can use it twice. But in the end, if you overuse certain global commons and the power over certain global commons, then unfortunately it all will come unravel. And the same thing can be done by other means as well. For example, global energy supplies. So just like we can question the weaponization of global payment system, we can also question weaponization of global energy supplies. I'm not pointing to any specific country, I'm pointing out at the concept. This can also be done with global food supplies, and so on and so forth. And of course, as you know, when there is a major crisis, like for example, we had the COVID crisis, it doesn't have to be active sanctions and weaponization. It can be in passive ways, through restricting access to certain things like vaccines. So there needs to be a global uh, understanding of how the global, how the commons that we all share around the world need to be managed. And we need to similarly have an understanding that these rules of engagement are not violated even in the most difficult of times. Because at any point in time, violating those rules may be very, very tempting to whoever in that particular space happens to have a leverage. But if everybody begins to pull their little leverage, then there is no global commons. And in some ways, this is how many of the institutions that we have created over the last 8 decades since the Second World War have all ended up getting jammed up. Whether it is the UN or the role played, for example, by the WHO during the COVID crisis, and so on and so forth. Many of them ended up not being effective because, for a variety of reasons, we did not think of the world as a family, but as interests of various segments. And anybody who, I'm sure you're part of, all of you are a part of some family, you will know that if one segment of the family, particularly a powerful segment of the family, begins to take its own interests into account as being paramount, then very quickly the family breaks down. Now, this brings me to one of my pet peeves of these days, which is the issue of environmental, social, and governance norms that are now being widely, I would use the word imposed, and I'm using it with care, on the world economy. Now, I have no problem with the impositions of some basic ESG norms. Clearly, we need it, but it should be something that we arrive at together. Unfortunately, these norms are not being arrived at through a consultation. Many of these ESG norms are simply ending up getting devised as global standards in the North Atlantic without any participation of countries in the rest of the world. And I'm specifically talking about developing countries on whom many of these norms are being applied, I would argue, unfairly. So the first point I'm making is that there must be greater consultation, particularly with the emerging countries, about the imposition of what these norms should be, i.e. the design of the norms, with specific norms. How do you decide, particularly when you're dealing with things like subjective things relating to governance, for example? What is good governance? It's ultimately a subjective topic. So something like that, or even social development, not every piece is objectively measurable. So the particular norms, the particular targets that we are placing have to be arrived at through a wider consultation. 2, who measures compliance to these norms? This too has to be a wider participation. Because what is happening is, just like we had with the system of sovereign ratings, where effectively 3 North Atlantic institutions, Moody's, S&P, and Fitch, ended up essentially dominating this conversation of sovereign ratings. We have the ESG system, which will be much more intrusive into your lives, into personal lives, into government policy, into corporate policies. These ESG norms will be measured. So even if you agree with the norms, the measuring of this, which are the agencies that will certify this, again has to be from a much more wider base, rather than from these same 3 sovereign rating agencies, another 3-4 think tanks, another 2-3 consultancies, all of them from the same tiny area in the North Atlantic. I'm coming to this over and over again because what will happen, and big danger is, because one group, and a relatively small group, with relatively little diversity ends up controlling this rather important space, there will always be a temptation to weaponize it. And so the first step towards avoiding such weaponization is to broad base it. Let there be participation of a wider population. Let Indonesia, Brazil, India, South Africa, which are part of the G20 and have the intellectual capacity to take on some of these projects, to voice the concerns of the developing world, let them take it up. And I'm not just trying to convert this into a developed country versus developing country issue. I mean, there are many issues that will be of concern even to developed countries. Because in fact, even in the US, there is a big debate that a relatively small clique, even in the US, has taken control of the ESG topic and is effectively imposing it even on US companies without too much consultation. A similar thing is happening even in Europe. So it is not as if this only affects developing countries, this also affects developed countries. And we need to have a wider conversation of what it is that we need collectively to agree on when we are trying to manage the global commons. Otherwise, what will happen is that you'll have these global commons and you'll have one of two things. One is, on one hand, there'll be a lot of resistance, unnecessarily in some cases. And two, the likelihood of these being weaponized in some ways, which may be construed to be neo-colonial. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.